I'm Mick O'Regan, and it's my great pleasure to be the moderator of this, the fifth of 8 webinars that ZEB have organised. Before we go too far, I'd like to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on tonight, which is the Bundjalung Nation, and the area is the far north coast of New South Wales, the hinterland of beautiful Byron Bay. I'd like to pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging. The ZEB webinar series, the EV Revolution, is designed to cover all aspects of electric vehicle adoption, from charging, driving range, converting combustion vehicles to other types of electric transport, and so on. Our aim is to encourage people to consider converting to an electric vehicle from an internal combustion engine car, to reduce their carbon emissions and to stop using fossil fuels. The only way we can do this is by the great work done by our sponsors, and I'd like to acknowledge them. Our principal sponsor is Bank Australia, our major sponsor is the NRMA, and our community sponsors are Innova Community Energy, Light Touch Solar and Electrical, and Club Car. As I said, this is the fifth webinar in our series, the EV Revolution. And tonight's edition is called Going the Distance. And we're all about fast charging and just how far we can drive our EVs. This is the last webinar for 2020, but there are some to look forward to in the coming year. Tonight, we've got two really special guests who both of whom are experts in the field. So it's a great pleasure to introduce firstly, Bryce Gaton. Bryce is the Secretary of the Victorian branch of the Australian Electric Vehicle Association, the AEVA. He's been working and writing on EVs since 2008. His interest comes in part from his desire to lead a low environmental impact lifestyle, plus the fact that electric vehicles are way cooler than internal combustion engine cars. His latest EV is a Hyundai Kona electric, in which Bryce has already covered over 20,000 kilometres, a third of which has been in interstate travel. We're also joined by Marty Andrews. Marty is the CEO and co-founder of Chargefox, Australia's largest open network of EV charging stations. Chargefox was started with a vision of powering road transport in Australia with renewable energy and an aim to make electric vehicle charging easier for all Australians. So in this, Bryce and Marty are going to be discussing EV charging, driving ranges and fast charging infrastructure. And then afterwards, we'll have a curated Q&A session. So for people joining us, thank you and welcome. And I'd like to begin after welcoming Bryce and Marty by getting Bryce for you to lead us off with your presentation.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Mick. I'll just move your picture over so I can look like I'm actually staring at the camera. How are you going, everybody? And I'm glad to have made it all tonight. If I'm sounding a little muddled and tired tonight, it's because I've actually been away for 3 days driving my EV down to Wye River here from Melbourne to Victoria and back. And that's comfortably over 400k round trip. And I didn't have to even bother worrying about charging either on the way there, back, or even whilst we were staying there. But that's another story that I'll come back to in a moment. Tonight, I'm going to talk about going the distance in terms of my own personal experience of driving EVs and a little bit about the current state of EV charging. And that'll roll into what Marty's talking about, where he's rolling out the chargers and where that's going to be going into the future. So moving on, because all us EV people are absolutely hopeless in coming up with all the acronyms, I thought I'll be kind to throw in a little pictorial of the different types of EV that are lurking around at the moment. PEV, as you may have heard, that's a plug-in electric vehicle. They're the ones with the 3-pin plugs, or sometimes 5, but it's another story, that will run, they'll be recharge their batteries. So you have their full battery electric vehicle, which is like my Hyundai Kona, the early Nissan Leafs, or the current Nissan Leaf, in fact, and a number of others around. There's about 11 full battery electric vehicles in Australia, and a significantly greater number around Australia, around the world. As I said, I am a little tired tonight. And your plug-in hybrids, which have the combination of a smaller battery with an internal combustion engine, that's that ICE bit up the front, internal combustion engine running on petrol, diesel, or gas. So you can have basically running on an oil fossil fuel or a 3-pin plug. And then you have the early Toyota Priuses, those types of things, which are a hybrid electric vehicle, the HEVs, and they are still electric cars, although they don't recharge. They're purely saving energy through the use of the regenerative braking, recharging the battery when the car brakes, and it saves between about 5 and 20% of the driving energy by saving that energy in the brakes. And in all of those three, all electric vehicles, that is one of the great advantages of electric vehicles, that the brakes never wear out effectively, and you don't have to bother cleaning all the brake dust off the front wheels anymore because you hardly ever use the brakes. I know my Kona coming up and around the windy roads past Lawn, I don't think I touched the brakes once on the whole trip because it's just lifting off the accelerator as just a nice amount of regenerative braking, and I've set it up on the maximum regen, so it actually slows me down without braking. And it's pretty much only as I'm pulling up the last little bit of traffic lights, or if I need a hard brake, that I ever use them at all. And the last car there is the fuel cell electric car, the FCEV. It's still, that's otherwise called the hydrogen car. They're still an electric car, even though they run on hydrogen, so to speak, because they use hydrogen in a chemical reaction to create the electricity. I won't go into the pros and cons of hydrogen. I've talked about that elsewhere. It's briefly, I don't see them having a huge future because it takes 3 to 5 times the amount of energy to create the hydrogen to move a car 100 Ks as it does to just simply plug it in and recharge it. So if you want to be paying for the amount of energy for moving a car, I don't really want to pay 3 to 5 times more for the electricity and the hydrogen as it does for the electric car in the first place, but that's another story. Anyway, a little bit more on electric car charging. EVSE is a term that gets thrown around a lot, so I better throw that in. Electric vehicle supply equipment. It's effectively what people now call the car charger. And there's two types. There's your AC ones, which are the ones on the left, so you can have a portable one, or you can have a one that bolts to the wall and you bring your own lead, and the councils and various community organisations like those because they don't have to look after the lead. There's a lot less vandalism involved, and you look after the lead yourself and keep it in the boot. So I keep one of those leads in my boot, and that's for AC charging. We'll talk a bit more about the different speeds of these chargers. Or you can have a tethered lead, which is part of the charger. I always say they're the best one to have at home because it just, you don't have to bother coiling up the lead and putting it away. It lives on top of the charger. If you're looking at the stuff on the highway, and this is where Marty will start talking more about it, it's the DC fast chargers, and you'll have those ones that look like Escape from Lost in Space film on the not quite far right. They're built by Tritium here in Australia, and they're generally around 50 kilowatts, although they're now putting out higher power ones now as well, and they're dotted all around New South Wales. You'll have seen them in that blue livery with the new NRMA on them, and they're a very handy thing, and I'll talk a little more about that in my use of them in the past. And then you've got the nice big chunky one from ABB, and they're 350 kilowatts or shared 175. I think that's the way they work out, but Marty will talk more about that in a little while. Okay, first up, how fast can I charge my EV? The key point with these things is it's not a one size fits all model. If you pull into a petrol station, you plug it in, you stand there and wait as your fuel pump attendant for the car, then wander in and pay for it. And if you're like one of the petrol stations I passed on the way back in the rain today, there was no canopy over it. So the poor people were standing, refilling their cars in the rain. And I'm going, hi, so don't miss that. But it is a different model. It's like plugging in your mobile phone rather than a car refilling. So it depends on what you're plugging it into as to how fast it'll charge. And these are very rough sort of numbers to give you some rough ideas. If you're plugging into a 10 amp ordinary power point, and my Kona will take about 28 hours. So it's not the world's fastest. But if I just want a quick top up, and that'll give me about 15 kilometers charge per hour. So if I just want a quick top up, I'm dropping into the friends and I would then pass by a DC fast charger in 10 Ks. I chat to them for an hour and I move on, or I stop for a coffee. So that's my emergency jerry can, like you would with a petrol car. If you ran out of petrol, that's your 4 litre jerry can that you've trotted off to get, and probably spend more than an hour getting the jerry can refilled, getting one in the first place, getting it filled, getting a lift back, tipping it into the car versus knock on the door and use a PowerPoint. I've only had to do that once, and that was sort of accidentally, deliberately anyway. That's another long story. You can plug into a 15 amp outlet, and that's the common one at the caravan parks and what have you. And if you plug into one of those, if you're anything 20% charge up to 100 charge, you'll be charged in about 15 hours. If I get in, and as I've done, I'll talk about the next slide, pulled into a caravan park at about 5 at night, plugged in, it's fully charged, ready to go my Kona the next day. The next step up is the ones that you'll have at home, and if you can do a full 32 amp charge, they will give you, and I can charge my Kona in 9 hours overnight. So I can get most of my charging is done overnight at the off-peak rate. And some of the cars, like the Renault Zoe, which does 3-phase, it'll actually do a full charge of its 40 kilowatt hour battery in about 2 3/4 hours. So, but most homes don't have 3-phase. But if you can find access to a 3-phase one, 3-phase will get faster again. The 50 kilowatt charger, my Kona will recharge at roughly 260 kilometers an hour, so to speak. So it'll take me about 1 1/3 hours to charge. If I'm out in the highway, basically 0 to 80%. There's a long story why it's 80%. Marty may mention it a bit more. The short answer is that it's because from 0 to 100 to roughly the same time as it goes from 80 to 100. So you really don't want to be charging. It's just one of the things you learn with EVs is when you're on the highway, you start off fully charged at 100%, and then you just top up to 80% along the way because it's the quickest way to move. A few little notes that I put in on that. These are not the manufacturer's data. These are ones that I've sort of roughly put together as just a charging table for people to get a reasonable idea of what happens. And I'll just talk a little about the Konas. Anyway, moving on. Is it early days? Are we still looking at the first, or comparison with the first petrol pumps being introduced just after World War I, which was 25 years after the first internal combustion engines came about? In fact, before that, there was only 2-gallon tins. Whoops. So that was the first 25 years. So maybe we're still there, maybe not. Last year, I did what we called the EV long weekend tour. That was 2,400 Ks around Victoria, 7 days. I didn't use any fast chargers, mainly because there weren't any on that route at that stage. And so this was the pre-fuel pump sort of analogy, using 24 or 2-gallon tins effectively. Guys were plugging into caravan parks or hotels at night. And the reason we did this, or I did this, was during that last election, federal election last year, our friend Scott Morrison, with his love of coal, was saying, oh, they'll ruin the long weekend. You know, the Labor policy will mean you'll never be able to go away a long weekend. So I didn't get angry. I just went, challenge accepted. And that's what I did. And I actually proved it. The car did it brilliantly, had no hassles, charging different methods, hotel, home, mostly caravan parks. Caravan parks are marriage made in heaven for EVs. So anyway, I went around there. The minor detail was the car did brilliantly. I was buggered by the end of that trip. So that's not a normal long weekend. So that was then, a bit over a year ago. Now, that's the number of DC fast chargers just on the Australian map there, all up the east coast, all clumped around bottom corner there around West Australia. And the announcement today was there's a whole new set of EV highway going in DC fast charging, going out to Kalgoorlie, Esperance, all sorts around the places around West Australia. So it's growing and growing. So effectively, I would say that we're at the stage of the petrol pumps are going in already. So we've already exceeded what was that first 25 years of the petrol car. We've actually got those. And outside of that is, yes, you are using 2-gallon cans, but 2-gallon cans are a lot less convenient than finding a power point or a power outlet to get you around. And people are doing trips around Australia easily in EVs now. TOCA, Tesla Owners Club of Australia, and the Australian Electric Vehicle Association actually several years ago had a project to get right around Australia, helping businesses install 3-phase outlets so you can plug in portable DC chargers that'll do 10 or 20 kilowatt hours. So 10 or 20 kilowatts, or for those cars that use 3-phase, like the Teslas, they can actually charge quite comfortably all the way around Australia now. So, and as an example of that, I was up in Sydney very late last year. I went up to visit some friends in Coffs Harbour. Now it was just about the time the bushfire started, and the highway down the coast was starting to be blocked. So I decided, quick look at the PlugShare app, really handy thing to look at because it shows you where all these charges are. And I went, yep, I can do it. I can actually go inland. So I actually went inland to Tamworth, into Dubbo, and then down, and I was back from Coffs Harbour, basically left Coffs Harbour. 2 days later, I was back in Melbourne with a full battery electric car. To me, I can say it's now that easy, provided you're using that network. Okay, the future. Well, I keep saying 80 to 90% of charging, that's what the stats are, is done at home. So I will also add to that one, 80 to 90% of petrol stations should start getting very nervous because they they effectively don't have a future if most of your charging and most of your choice of a petrol price cycle or a fuel price cycle is when you want it and not when the fuel companies decide it's, because I can charge overnight if I want to, or I can charge at the day rate if I want to, or if I can want to, I'll pay the rates at the DC fast chargers to get that quick convenient charge if I need it, if I'm on the way and I forgot the charge. But most of people's charging will be done at home. You'll be able to charge at work, and if they put in the big solar systems like that, it will be lovely, clean, green energy for fueling your cars. There are community DC chargers. That one's down in here in Victoria that went in. I think they're actually replacing that one. They're putting in another one in and a better one in than that one. That's community charging in a communal area. There is, of course, the networks. Tesla are building out their own, and that's the one in Keith in South Australia. There is the NRMA network that I mentioned earlier. It's the one placed right in front of the NRMA building in Sydney, which would have to be about the worst positioned EV charger I have been to in most of Australia. I have got various photos of trying to get that poor lead to plug into my car. And I was thinking it would not have even gone to the middle for a Leaf. So they'd have had to try and position it. And someone very kindly parked their crane directly behind it. So it was far. I was actually nudged up against the crane to get it to be able to plug in at all.
I know people, Bryce, I know people have actually driven up onto the curb in that location to be able to use that charge.
There's a document put out by the Queensland government about best practice and best positioning of EV charging, and I don't think that fits any one criterion that it's got for it.
It's the thought that counts.
The thought that counts. It's outside their office. They've want to make a statement, and the statement was, "We're early adopters. We haven't thought it through yet." But that's I didn't say.
Well,
that.
they learnt. They got better.
Yes.
Yep.
No, I take my hat off to them. Their network throughout New South Wales is superb, and I truly wish we could have such a good system here in Victoria. Queensland.
Bryce, just to jump in momentarily.
Yes, please.
When you talk about the PlugShare app, that's plugshare.com. Could you just give us, for people who aren't familiar with it, just a little bit more about that app?
Yes, I think I wrote a slide. I don't know where it is. I think it's actually another presentation I'm doing tomorrow. But the PlugShare app, you can toggle. You can log into it and save your car, so it'll pull up exactly the sort of charges you can use. Or you just log in as plugshare.com. Scroll the map past America, because it always starts at America, go down to Australia, and then you'll pull up preferences, and then you can just toggle all the types of plugs. And there's that one map that I showed you, I just toggled only CCS2 DC fast chargers, which is what my Kona uses, and that was showing all the CCS2, and probably accidentally most of the Chatamo ones that the Nissan Leaf uses as well. But that app is really handy and I can toggle it with 3-phase outlets. I can toggle it for 3-pin plugs. I can toggle it for caravan park outlets, all sorts of things. So whatever type of touring I do, if I'm just traveling caravan to caravan park, we'll see the caravan parks that are more EV friendly in there. We'll see businesses that have put them in and support people coming in and parking there and dropping in for a cuppa. It's a really useful sharing app. There is another one that's just starting up, which I haven't got the URL to, but I can post it up later through Bridie or yourselves.
Great,
but
thank
it's
you.
quite good. And that last one that I put down there is what Marty will start talking about. That's Barnawartha North, just south of Albury here in Victoria. So as far, most of those charges, I feel sorry for Chargefox at the moment, because not a lot of your usage of your charges yet. So I had no problems getting, except for the Mittagong RSL. Generally, it's a half-hour wait for that one, but it is the only one in Australia so far that there is a queue for. Everywhere else.
That's an NRMA charger at Mittagong RSL, and I know that that's probably the most requested site that they have to put in an additional charger.
Yes.
So they get lots of queuing there, yeah.
Yep, yeah, I have reached a stage of I will charge before, and I'll make sure I charge at Jugiong or Holbrook or somewhere, just to make sure I don't have to use the Mittagong one, because I'll just leave it for the locals. The RSL is right next to it, and it just happens to be very handy for everyone to pull in, charge up, and have dinner.
Good, yeah, good pub lunch there.
Yes. And so, yeah, that's the one that Marty will talk about, and how they're rolling out, and they've been brilliant, and they're just really good positioning so far, and rolling them out further. So that's the future of the traveling network. If you want to find out more about this sort of stuff and where it's going, and want to hear from people who are actually used to driving these things and people that own them, I can heartily recommend the Australian Electric Vehicle Association, and we charge the enormous sum of $50 for a personal member individual membership, or for concession is $25. And for small businesses, dealers, all that service providers, lead providers, all that sort of companies, it's only $125 for a corporate membership. So yeah, why not join? You get lots out of it. There's a 60 to 70 page quarterly e-magazine put out with lots of EV information, and our website, which is available to the public for these fact sheets. There's a 2-page standard format fact sheet written about every EV or full battery EV on the market in Australia. And I add to those as they come out on the market. And there's another list, a 1-pager that's threatening very soon, I think, to go over 1 page, but I'm trying very hard with small print to keep it on 1, which lists all the battery electric vehicles and the plug-in hybrid electric vehicle prices and their general specs, towing capacities, battery sizes, and their current on-the-road prices. So yes, please come and join us at the AEVA. And I think, yes, and that was me parked at one of the, on the way back from Dubbo, I think, on Coffs Harbour that trip. So questions I'll leave to the end, and I'll hand over to Mick and Marty to talk about the DC charging network that's rolling out.
That's great. Look, thank you very much. For people just joining us, you've been listening to Bryce Gaton, the Vice Chair of the Victorian branch of the Australian Electric Vehicle Association, the AVEA. Thank you, Bryce. Now, look, we're going to move on now to Marty Andrews. Marty is the CEO and co-founder of Chargefox, Australia's largest open network of EV charging stations, to give us our next presentation. Over to you, Marty. I suspect you might need to unmute, Marty.
Thank you. I couldn't find the unmute button once my screen was being shared, so I had to unscreen my screen momentarily. Hang on, I'll be right back at you. And I'll start that again.
It comes as a great relief to me, Marty, that you're having these problems, let me tell you.
There you go. And I'm a career IT guy before I did all this too. So I think you can hear me now, okay?
All good.
Great, fantastic. Okay, thanks. Hi, everyone. So I'm Marty. I'm the founder and CEO of Chargefox. And we run the largest EV charging network in Australia. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've been building and share some of the stats that things that we're learning about Australian drivers and how they use these chargers as well. So here's a bit of a glance of the map of Chargefox pins. There's a couple of different types of pins here on the map. You can see some lightning bolts that look like they have wind coming off them. They're the ultra rapid sites. The ones that are just single lightning bolts are fast chargers, and all the others are AC chargers. And I'll talk about how many of them there are in a minute. But what we've done since about late 2017 is been managing this network. And I did a talk like this at the AEVA Expo in Sydney 12 months ago. So this is basically an update to talk about what's happened in the last 12 months or so. We've all time managed over 150,000 charging sessions in Australia. Last year that was 50,000. So there's been about 100,000 charging sessions in a year. So we're seeing some significant growth, and I'll talk more about that as well as we go. This is the size of the network, and you can see it kind of growing over time. So we manage over 1,600 plugs. Plugs is the thing that we talk about. It's a bit complex. Some stations have 2 plugs, some have 1. So plug seems to be the thing that's easier to describe. So 1,600 plugs. Roughly 950 of them are in that big red section. They're actually private chargers. So they're in people's apartments, or they're back-to-base chargers for fleets in those kind of situations. So that means there's about 650 that are public on the public network. And that's mostly those section at the top, the ultra rapid, the fast, and the AC chargers. As of now, we manage over 100 DC chargers on the networks. That's 200 plus DC plugs on the fast charging network. And that's growing all the time. You can see the chart kind of gets bigger every month. We add roughly 5 plugs every week to the network. Now we don't own all of those plugs. We're managing them on other people's behalf. So lots and lots of commercial entities. They could be local councils, shopping centres, businesses put in public charges, and then they ask us to manage them for them, to put them on the public network and make them available in their Chargefox app that you can kind of download and use to find all these things and use them and pay for them if there's a price on them. One of the great secrets about charging across the network is in the AC charger section, that big blue one, a great big chunk of them are actually free. Lots of shopping centres will put charging stations in, and they're really keen for you to kind of go inside and spend money at their shops, so they give away free charging. Certainly the fast and the ultra rapid charging is not free, and some of the AC charging is not free. And I think we'll see a trend over time to more and more pricing appear as the market grows. But right now they're keen to kind of get people out there and using these things. Now, a couple of years ago, we raised a bunch of money and got some government funding to build some ultra rapid stations. So I've got photos of heaps of them here, but I'm just going to pull out a couple to show you what they look like. This is the first one that we ever built. This is in Euroa in Victoria. For anyone who's not from Victoria, this is about an hour north of Melbourne as you head up the Hume towards Sydney. And what you can see here is the two taller charging stations are the ABB stations that Bryce was referring to earlier. So they're capable of charging up to 350 kilowatts, but they'll actually balance the power between them dynamically. And the two on the right are 50 kilowatt chargers from tritium. So they're made here in Brisbane in Australia. And all of them have both, there's two plugs on each of them. There's a CCS2 plug and a CHAdeMO plug. So you can, if your car's capable of DC charging, then you can use these chargers basically is how it works. What you can see in the background is a few big boxes. The big set of boxes on the right there is where all the power is being processed for the ultra rapid chargers. And there's a switchboard, and the big box on the left is about a 400 kilowatt hour battery. So they're actually using batteries to buffer the energy for these charging stations. What you can't see here on off screen is there's 100 kilowatts of solar that's kind of charging up those batteries. So this site is powered completely by renewable energy, as are all our sites, but because we always buy green power contracts from the grid no matter what. But in this particular case, we also have solar on site that is charging up the batteries. So that's what one of the sites looks like. To give you a sense of cost, we raised about $15 million. One of these sites is $750,000, so it's quite expensive things to build, the ultra rapid stations. And it's useful to bear that in mind as context when if you're thinking about the pricing of these things. The ultra rapid stations in particular are very expensive to build. You can put in one of these tritium 50 kilowatt chargers for quite a bit less than that. It's almost a tenth of the cost. You could put one of them in for $75,000 and an AC charger for a few $1,000s commercially. So the costs are quite different. But these big ultra rapid ones are designed to put on the highways when you're doing long distance travel between cities, like driving Melbourne to Sydney or Sydney up to Brisbane, for example. So that's why we kind of put those in to kind of plug that gap. So that's one of them. This is another site at Barnawartha North. Bryce had a photo of this. Same setup here, but the reason I'm putting this one here is not because of those stations, but because of this, which is right next to it. So that's 100 kilowatts of ground mount solar. And same kind of deal, we use that to power the charging stations. So that's a bit of a trend that we try to use whenever we can, is to put in local on-site renewable energy to get that visual tie-in of we are using renewables to support EV charging.
Marty, I'm going to jump in here just for a moment because I have quite an interesting question. From Duncan Day, who's asked, who firstly says, "G'day, Marty," and asks, is there a reason for the gap in stations along the east coast between Sydney, Newcastle, Sydney, Wollongong, and the Gold Coast?
I think the reason is just that they're probably not all built yet. So I'm a Victorian, so I struggle to visualize that in my head. But what we're doing is for the ultra rapid chargers. So when we're building these sites with the ultra rapid chargers on them, our goal for that original rollout was to connect the major cities. So Adelaide through to Melbourne, up the Hume to Sydney, and then on to Brisbane. We also have one in Tasmania and 2 in WA. But on that East Coast one, Adelaide across to Melbourne and up to Brisbane, they're designed to be about 200 kilometres apart, so that if you need to travel between the major cities, you can get there. Almost all cars that are capable of DC charging can make it 200 Ks, they can charge up and they can kind of keep going on the next leg of that. That plan had 22 sites on it. We have opened 18 of those sites, so I think there's 4 to come. And we're getting to construction on all of those this year. So come early next year, all of those sites will be open. So some of the gap is in New South Wales, and if you're talking about coastal, then it's just a different project. Basically, once we've done all of this, we will continue going bigger and better next year and beyond. And there's lots of you might have seen state governments talking about funding, etc. So there are more plans coming, but those few sites that still remain are in the New South Wales section. So, but they'll be coming early next year. All right. So the solar. Now this was the first site that we built in Brisbane. So different kind of charger here. Those 2 chargers on the right are both 350 kilowatt chargers from Tritium. The one on the left is a 50, so it's similar to what we had seen before. But here, instead of using the ABB chargers, we used Tritium chargers. These ones happen to only have 1 plug on them, which is a CCS2 plug, so there's no CHAdeMO plug on them. The CHAdeMO vehicles can only charge at up to 50 kilowatts anyway, which is why there's a 50 kilowatt charger there. But we will see some with both plugs on later. So at the time this was installed, Tritium simply didn't make the 350s with both plugs on them. So that's what a 350 kilowatt Tritium looks like. This one is a bit of a marquee site. So when we raised some money, we got some money from the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, but also some money from the Victorian government. So this is at a shopping centre in Melbourne at Airport West. And this is the biggest charging site in the Southern Hemisphere. So what you can see there is on the 4 chargers on the right-hand side are all 350 kilowatts. And the 2 on the left are 50 kilowatts. And we can run all 6 of those chargers at full power simultaneously. So that's 1.5 megawatts of power that is potentially output from that site. So that's a real biggie. Now I'll just flick through some of these because I think we've seen some of these before. They're all very similar setups. Gundagai, Launceston. I'll pause here momentarily. So this is we had looked at the 350 kilowatt chargers from Tritium with just 1 plug. So here's an example with 2 plugs. So they're available now. So we're using them on most of the newer sites. And you can also see here an accessibility, a disabled parking bay on the left-hand side. That's a thing that we've been trying to do on all of our sites. And we've also been lobbying quite hard for the government to do a proper analysis and trial setup of an accessible site for EV chargers. So whilst we have an a disabled parking bay there with access to the charger, it's not necessarily straightforward for someone in a wheelchair, for example, to get up onto the curb to go and get the cable, pull it out of the charger, get it back to their car and plug it in. And it needs a lot more thought about how that can work. So we're lobbying pretty hard to get driver with disability access for EVs so that we can get some standards around that going forward. But in the meantime, you'll see disabled parking bays on most of our sites. And I was going to flick across to this site in Ballina and just kind of comment on this one. I know this webinar is going much wider than just Byron, but this is the closest one to Byron, so I presume there might be some Byron locals around. So this is in Ballina, not far from there. I've never actually seen this site in the flesh because lockdown prevented me from getting there. So, but that's what that one looks like. So local site for anyone from Byron there. And then a few more. I'm just going to flick over these. That one's in South Australia. Awesome. And this was the first one built in Perth. If anyone's from Perth on the webinar, hello to you. That's at the Australand Shopping Centre in bright RAC yellow. So they're all sites that we have built. There are still 4 to come, as I mentioned. But in addition to sites that we build, we also manage charges on behalf of others. And this is an example. So the Queensland Electric Superhighway runs up most of the coast of Queensland. The charges are all, those sites are all built and owned by Eureka, but they are managed by Chargefox. So here's an example with a DC fast charger, but also a Schneider EV Link. That's an example of a socket-based charger that Bryce was talking about earlier. So you need to bring your own cable to kind of plug into where that little black circle is. There's a socket there. And quite common to see them around the place. Site hosts are generally worried about vandalism of cables, so they use these to kind of protect on that. Sorry, I didn't mean to get to it quite yet. Yeah, so we manage lots of sites on behalf of others as well, and you can find all of them in the Chargefox app, and it makes it easy to kind of get around and use them and pay for them if there's a price on them. Now, I was going to dive into some statistics about some things that we learned about people charging in Australia. This graph is fascinating to me. That is what it looks like when you have a pandemic, when you run a charging network. So things were going along quite swimmingly until about March this year, and then usage of our network fell off a cliff. So we were growing, you can kind of see the shape of the curve. We were growing, you know, following a reasonably exponential curve, which was a combination of adding more plugs and more cars coming to Australia. And then everyone went into lockdown and it stopped. And this goes to the end of October. In November, there was some more recovery. Lockdown in Victoria in particular has only kind of just ended. So we're expecting that to recover a little bit more, but yeah, that smacked us pretty hard. And we process about 350 sessions a day, hopefully growing again. I checked just before this meet, there was about 106 people charging. So that's pretty common, especially during the day, that there's over 100 people charging on our network at any given time. Someone plugs in on average on the network every 4 minutes. So there's kind of lots and lots of things going on. So that's what the sessions look like. This is when people charge. Now, I did this, a version of this slide last year at the AEVA presentation, and was much more focused around midday, but this kind of seems to hang around for a bit of time now. So what we see is people charge kind of between 11, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to click, 11 up till about 5 p.m. is kind of the peak times, the big kind of range there. And most of the growth is in the AC charges. If you look in the red bits in the middle, actually they're pretty stable, but it's the AC charges. So they'll be at shopping centres, for example. So people are going to the shops, plugging in and going and do their shopping and just letting their cars charge whilst they're doing that. This is how long people stay plugged in. And this year I've broken this out into AC charges and fast charges and ultra rapid charges. So roughly 2/3 of people are plugging in for an hour or less. And if you extend that to 2-hour charges, that's 84% of our charging sessions are under 2 hours, which kind of makes sense a lot for AC charges because people plug them in and they go and run an errand. So that's basically kind of the errand time. They're not trying to charge their car fully in those scenarios. They're usually coincidentally charging their car because they can, because it's convenient to, whilst they're doing something else. When you switch to fast chargers though, those sessions get on average much shorter. So almost everyone is under an hour on a fast charger, and it's the same for an ultra rapid charger. Then there's the question of how much power do they put in the battery? One of the most common questions I get asked all the time is, how long does it take to charge your car? And I'm sure Bryce gets that as well. In my mind, it's the wrong question to ask. And the reason it's the wrong question to ask is because people don't fill up their car. That's not how they behave with EV chargers. Most people I know with a petrol vehicle will run it until it's down to a quarter of a tank or less. And in fact, sometimes even until the little red light comes on and starts blinking on them. So they run it right down, and then they go to a petrol station, they fill it all the way back up. And if all you've ever done is drive a combustion engine vehicle, your analogy in your mind is just that that's what it must be like for an electric vehicle. But it's not true. People who drive electric vehicles overwhelmingly do lots and lots of small top-ups rather than one big charging session. So you can debate where I've drawn the line there if you like. So I've kind of picked off 45 kilowatt hours or less. Lots of EVs these days, like the Kona is a 64 kilowatt hour battery. You can go up to, there's 80, 90, 100 kilowatt hour batteries. So that's a Kona filling up would be kind of in the right-hand side there, for example. But yeah, lots and lots of top-ups. That's what AC chargers look like. Fast chargers are similar. Slightly less people in the top-up zone for fast chargers, and slightly less again in the ultra rapids. But part of that is just a function of time. Remember, people stay plugged in. So even if you're on an ultra rapid charger, if you plug in and go into the shops, you might be on a long road trip, go into the shops, grab a bite to eat, go to the bathroom, and get your kids all sorted. You almost can't help but put that much power in your car because the car is charging so quickly. So yeah, that's, but still overwhelmingly top-ups. And that's a thing that I think people don't understand when they first think about EVs and how they get driven.
Marty, I'd like to just jump in there and ask you, because that sort of touched something that I really did want to ask you about. And that's that notion, I suppose, of range anxiety. And Bryce earlier had a photograph, that infamous photograph of the Prime Minister holding a lump of coal in the Parliament. And that idea that electric vehicles or a policy aimed at promoting electric vehicles was going to so-called ruin the long weekend drive. That the notion that people are a bit anxious, possibly, particularly people who are uncertain about EVs, are things like, for example, a car's display of remaining driving range. Is that reliable? Sometimes, petrol gauges in ICE cars are a bit dodgy. Could I just get both of you to reflect on that notion of range anxiety and how it affects perceptions of EVs?
I might start off on that one. It was just, I had an early Leaf, and the range estimate on those were better described as the GOM. They weren't the range estimators, they're the guessometer, because they were very inaccurate. In my Kona, it would be accurate to the kilometer pretty much. It's based on your current driving pattern, and it's pretty much, if you stick to that driving pattern after you charge, you'll get that range. The other side of the coin is, or two sides of the coin actually. One is if you do what I did, which is I've been beetling around town for ages, recharged last weekend and then went to Wye River, so it was saying I'd had 540k range. I did about 450 rather than 540, purely because I was zooming down the highway at 100 kilometers an hour. So I know that they will do that if I change the highway, but if I'm on the highway, I'll get 420 to 450 comfortably and possibly more. Around town, I'll get 550 plus, which is pretty much 500 plus, which is pretty much on a par with a petrol car anyway. And B, the Kona dashboard, it gives you so many warnings and estimates and range, and it'll give you warnings long before it's going to be a problem. And the other side of the coin is, again, I keep having this multi-sided coin. When I was doing that long weekend drive, I hit the top of Mount Hotham, and I was about 5k short of my destination on the range, and I went, I've got an EV, I don't care, I'll be right. It recharges on the way downhill. And by the time I got to the bottom of the mountains heading towards Albury, I had 50k's more than I needed to get there rather than, so yeah. suck on that, ICE cars. My car refuels itself on the way if you go downhill.
There you go. Marty, I have just a quick follow-up on that. There seems to be a sense that an EV, the rate of charging will slow down after it reaches about 80% full. Is that the case? And if so, why?
Yes. The percentage varies wildly. So every car has a different type of, every model of car has a different type of charge curve, what we call a charge curve, which is the rate that they fill their battery at. So the cars have a battery management system in them that are controlling how fast you can fill the car. Basically what happens is that the rate of charge is a combination of how powerful the charger is and what the car will allow. So when you turn up to one of our ultra rapid sites, for example, and you plug into a charger that can do 350 kilowatts, the charger will never be slowing the rate of charge down. It will always be the car. So the car will, if you're at almost empty, it'll probably go to maximum charge rate and then it'll fill. Some cars taper off slowly. Some have stepped patterns. So they might get to 50% drop down, get to 70% drop down, get to 80% drop down. But the analogy is basically like filling up a glass with water. You can pour quite quickly when it's empty, but as you get to the top, you kind of have to slow down because you're filling up the last little bit and you don't want it to overflow. So cars have to do a bit of work when the battery is nearly full to manage the power fitting into the battery. So Bryce is right on that front. They do slow down over time. Certainly, 80% is a reasonable rule of thumb, as you'll get a very high rate of charge up to there. Some cars will slow down a bit earlier. Some cars will slow down a bit later. We've most recently seen the Audi e-trons come to market, and they're capable of doing 150 kilowatts. But they go to 150 kilowatts and stay there for a very long time to roughly 90%, I think. So you can before they start tapering off. So all the cars are a bit different, but it's a good rule of thumb, and they will slow down towards the end.
Right, and just a follow-up question that's come in from one of our listeners. The EV buses, you've talked about different cars and different charging rates. Now, obviously, EV buses are a huge interest because it's public transport, carry a lot of people. What are your thoughts, both of you, your thoughts on EV buses and fast charging them?
Yeah.
Sorry, Marty, you go first.
I was going to say, I think it's a great initiative. There's a couple of different categories to think about. One is domestic urban routes, if you like. EV buses are very easy to control in terms of charging when they're doing a known route, driving around in a circle, back and forth on a route. It's a different kettle of fish if you're talking about an EV coach that does a holiday trip, for example. But if you have known routes, it's quite easy to plan their charging. And sometimes you can charge them up even en route. There are gantry type systems, so you might get to a major stop and have the bus being charged, from through the roof whilst people are getting on and off it, for example. So you can do top-up charges on the way. And I think there's an excellent case to be made for EV buses and charging them using fast chargers.
Yeah, very much so. The EV buses are being taken up big time around the world. China, I think it's Shenzhen or one of those provinces, has replaced its entire fleet of 10,000 or more buses with full battery EVs. There's a group of cities, just small places like Rio de Janeiro and Auckland and Paris, have all signed up to a pledge to replace their buses with low or zero emission and taking up electric buses in the next few years. So it's a C40 initiative or C40 coalition. I actually did a quick typing answer to that question, saying that would be a whole topic on its own of buses. There's trams that have go through heritage regions in one city in Germany, where they have a battery and a recharging system that goes underneath between the tracks, and they have batteries, so they use the pantograph and they'll lose the wire so they don't disfigure the heritage area, run around on the tracks on their batteries, as well as a charging system to keep them going for a number of Ks, and then they go back to using the pantograph. So there's a whole gamut of stuff around public transport and battery vehicles, not just buses, it's trams and other areas as well.
Thank you, Bryce. I reckon that's obviously worthy of a future webinar topic. But Marty, let's keep going with your presentation.
Thank you. I'm on the home stretch, so I just want to leave you with a couple of stats that we're very proud of. Mick, you mentioned right up front that the reason that Chargefox was formed was to power road transport with renewable energy. So we're trying to publish some information about how that's going. In 2019, at the end of 2019, we figured out that we'd done powered over 1 million kilometers that were traveled purely on renewable energy. I can tell you that just in November, and bear in mind we're still coming out of a pandemic, we would have done over $200,000 just in $200,000 kilometers, sorry, just in 1 month. So we will smash that record this calendar year, and it's great to see that number still going. To put that in some different numbers that people might be familiar with, we're abating over 50 tons of CO2 every month. All of the ultra rapid chargers on our network are powered with renewable energy. All of the fast chargers on the Queensland Electric Superhighway are powered with renewable energy, as are some other chargers around the network. And even without that, the grid has some element of renewable energy in it and is getting greener every year. So these numbers should go up and up and up. And that's not just us. Like the thank you here is really all of the EV drivers, and hopefully that's many of you who are watching at home right now. It's making a difference. So it's a thing that we're really proud of, and I think the community should be really proud of as well. And that's me.
Marty, thank you so much. That was really interesting. Both presentations have been really great. Look, I've got a couple of questions, but I'd also obviously encourage any of our attendees to send in their questions. I'm just wondering, does fast charging affect battery life?
I think the answer to that's yes. I'm no battery scientist. The short answer is yes, but I don't think it's as significant as people worry about. There's plenty of stats out there with drivers that have done lots of long distance driving. A good example is the guys who run the Tesla chauffeur service in Sydney. They've done hundreds of thousands of kilometers, and they were still getting 95% plus range out of their batteries compared to when they were originally bought. And the manufacturers are all beginning to put long life warranties on the batteries as well. So I think so. I don't know if you know any more, Bryce. I don't have the kind of science behind the numbers, but
no, it's more anecdotal. Yeah, the people with the higher K in the Teslas and things are finding that there's very little. It's just the 1 or 2% sort of degradation that you would get as per normal, whether it's fast charge or not. Nissan are warranting the Nissan Leaf battery for home DC grid to vehicle to grid or vehicle to home type system. So that's obviously doing a lot more charges via the DC system. So I don't think it may weaken the battery a little bit over time, but it'll be infinitesimal compared to just what its normal aging process is.
I do think there's a bit of history biting us there. Like the first generation Nissan Leafs probably didn't have great battery management systems, and I know those batteries do kind of wear out, but the more modern vehicles are much better.
Yeah, the early Nissan Leaf had relatively poor chemistry. The battery management was good, but it had no battery cooling whatsoever in it, and that was his problem. In hot climates, they declined at twice the rate. So in Arizona, for instance, in the desert, they were declining by double what Nissan expected them to do. They did come to the party and replace those batteries, but yes, they gave them a very bad reputation, and they're not helping their cause by, even in the current Leaf, it's still no cooling system in it, whereas pretty much every other manufacturer puts some form of active cooling, most of which are actually liquid cooling systems around the battery to keep them nicely in a nice even temperature, to just look after the chemistry. It's just a chemical reaction. If you treat it kindly with the right temperature, it will be a lot happier, and it's both hot and cold too.
Okay. Now, I'd like to return both of you to stuff that has been mentioned, I have to acknowledge, but I do think it's really significant for people who are making the decision to go to EVs, and that's that concern about running out of charge away from home. And Bryce, you told us a cute little story at the start about dropping it in on a friend and plugging in. But can we just discuss this a little bit more about that concern that people may have that they will run out of charge. They're away from home, and it becomes an issue for them.
Yeah, I would say with the longer range battery EVs that are around now, range anxiety is dead. I mean, I don't worry about it anymore. I used to worry about it a little bit with the Leaf. It was sort of became range awareness with the Leaf rather than range anxiety because it had 100, 120k range. It was somewhat annoying, but the current Kona, I don't worry. I mean, I've done all sorts of interstate trips in it, and I'll just hop from one charge, DC fast charge to the next, or to a caravan park for the night. And I know what the range is. I know what the distance is that I'm going to the next stop. My GPS system in the car will easily tells me what I can and can't do. If I plug in an address and it gets grumpy about that address because it's a bit far, I just find a charger through PlugShare. At the moment, there's not quite so many chargers as there are petrol stations for fast charge, but there's a hell of a lot more power points than there are jerry cans.
Yeah, I'd say, Mick, there's 2 or 3 factors here. One is there's a bit of a saying that we have internally that the only people who have range anxiety are people that don't drive EVs. No, that's not.
That's probably true.
It's not completely true, but it is certainly true that like once you drive an EV for a short period of time, you become quite accustomed to it, and it becomes much less of an issue than you think it is. There's certainly an onus on players like Chargefox and other industry players to put in more charging stations. It's why we began building that ultra rapid network. Part of the anxiety lies in just not seeing the infrastructure, but as more and more of it pops up and you see it where you drive around, the anxiety starts to lessen. And finally, I think there's still a chance that your battery can run out in the same way that you can run out of petrol when you're in the middle of nowhere. And the answer is kind of the same. You can get your car towed to a place where you can fill it up. And that place could be much closer than you think if it's an EV, because you just need a power point. It really depends on how long you've got to wait, I guess. But if that could be a motel up the road, you could plug in and wait for several hours, or you could get towed to a fast charger somewhere and try and charge up much quicker. Very similar to what you would do if you had a petrol vehicle. In the other direction, though, like in a petrol vehicle, you got to go and get a jerry can and bring it back. But same kind of model, right?
Yeah. Bryce, were you indicating you wanted to add something?
I did. I had a great thought, and that brain cell fell asleep. Sorry about that. Just
That's right.
The day's driving caught up with me. I just went.
I need to charge mine up. It's that last 20% where it slows down, according to Marty. Now listen, I want to ask another question that's come in. I hope I get this right. It's from Duncan Day, and I'm just going to read it. And he basically says this: I live off grid, and hear that instead of owning house batteries and a car battery, I could use the car to run the house and use the house panels to charge the car. The house has a 30 kilowatt of storage similar to a car. So the question is, does this make sense?
I think off grid's hard, but certainly there is some sense in this. So there's been some announcements recently that AGL and Chargefox are about to embark on a project together where we do some vehicle to grid testing. So with the new Nissan Leafs, what most people don't do the math, but a typical car battery, if you had something like a Kona or an iPace or an EQC, so you're in the 60 to 80 kilowatt hour battery range, you can run your house for days and days and days off that battery. So there's a lot of power in there. I think a lot of people don't realize just how much is in there. So yes, you can fill your car battery using solar if you've got that, and if you've got a vehicle to grid or a vehicle to something kind of capable car like a Nissan Leaf, you could charge your car during the day and then run your house off the car at night. That is absolutely technically feasible. And as long as the total power that you generate during the day off solar is less than the total power that you use in your house in 24 hours, then you can do that in perpetuity in theory, and still, probably drive your car somewhere when you need to. Off grid is hard. Like we're certainly, the testing that we're doing is on grid, but intended to reduce people's energy consumption dramatically. The grid is always there in those cases when you can test it. But Duncan, if you're willing to give it a go, I'd love to hear that story. Those sorts of pioneering activities are great to see.
Okay, and now there's a question from David Long who says, in highways, there are signs saying the last petrol station kilometres. Can we impose something similar, say, for example, to Chargefox? I know, according to David, he says, I know on the Hume Highway between Sydney and Albury, there are charges at Goulburn and Gunnedah and Albury. But is that a possibility, do you think, Marty and Bryce?
That sounds like a great idea. Sort of instead of saying next petrol station, it's next EV charge. What do you think, Marty?
Yeah, I would love to see it personally. Like I think we don't control the sign. So for us, essentially just to explain how it works, we are our charges are in those on the highways. They're often there's a roadside service centre which will have a petrol station, but it'll have maybe a McDonald's and a KFC and a coffee shop and another cafe, and there's bathrooms there and a big kind of food court area. Chargefox is leasing a few of the car parks on that site, but we don't own the property. We don't own the major signage. We can put signage on our little piece, but not on the rest of it. And the road signs are usually controlled by some level of government. So they need to buy into that as well. I note that there is some government initiatives coming about around standardizing car parking signs and being able to fine people if they ice EV charging bays. And that sort of stuff is great, but it's not a thing that I have any authority to control. Like the governments, I can lobby for it, I can ask for it, but the governments have to decide.
Okay, look, thank you both. Time waits for no person, and it certainly hasn't waited for us. I want to thank, firstly, all the people who've been part of tonight and have tuned in to listen. I particularly want to thank our two guests. Marty Andrews is the Chief Executive Officer and the co-founder of Chargefox, Australia's largest open network of EV charging stations. And Bryce Gaton is the Vice Chairperson of the Victorian branch of the Australian Electric Vehicle Association, the AVEA. Your presentations were really terrific. They were informed and wonderfully presented. So thank you very much to both of you. While I'm thanking people, I'd like to thank the sponsors who've made this webinar series possible. This is the 5th of 8. And our principal sponsor is Bank Australia. Our major sponsor is the NRMA, and our community sponsors are Innova Community Energy, Light Touch Solar and Electrical, and Club Car. Also thanks to the team at Zero Emissions Byron, our IT specialist Glenn Todd, Bridie Schmidt, Muriel Watt, and Christabel Munson, as well as Chris Sanderson. Our next event, we're going to have a break over the summer holidays, but our next event is Tuesday, the 2nd of February, and it's Last Mile in Your Own Backyard with Wolfgang Rothman and eMotion and Sally Perini from Zero Mo. So if you're interested, that's our next webinar, Tuesday, the 2nd of February, 6 p.m. And what we're planning, a post-COVID live EV expo and forum in mid-2021. Not used to saying 2021 yet, but check it out on the Zero Emissions Byron website, all the W's, zerobyron.org/webinars. Zero Emission Byron has now staged 5 free monthly webinars since August. You can go online to the website and be able to look at them. I'm Mick O'Regan. It's been a real pleasure to be part of this webinar. I hope you'll join us for the next one. And as we say, charge on. Thank you.